There we go. This is session number, my goodness, 28 of New Testament survey. We've come all the way through the Gospels now. We're all the way into the book of Acts. And we've been following the young church in action as it expands from Jerusalem to Judea and Samaria into the Galilee, finally into Syria in the north, south into Egypt, and now we're going to see the expansion of the church into the Greek world proper. Paul has already been on his first journey to Asia Minor, which is modern Turkey. He's going to cross the Dardanelles and go on into Greece proper. Actually, he'll be crossing this water that you see in the background, which is the Aegean Sea, and he'll follow the Egnatian Way across northern Greece and finally make his way south to Athens and Corinth. And Paul's trip is quite an adventure. It's a travel log of monumental proportions. Paul's travel is something that any ambitious and motivated person in the ancient world could have done. The ships came and went, the roads were available, and they were well patrolled by the Roman armies. Paul's travel could have been done by just about anybody who really wanted to. Merchants, tradesmen of various kinds, routinely made these trips. By our standards, Paul's trips were really hard. A lot of walking and maybe the occasional donkey and very slow, rickety boats that were prone to sinking. To us, that sounds like just terrible conditions. But in the ancient world, this was actually quite good, quite tolerable. And many, many people traveled to and fro throughout the entire Roman world. Paul was simply following in the footsteps of others, not pioneering. And I find it fascinating that the world was just right when the church was planted. There's never been a time before or since when all of the pieces fell together. If you were going to turn the world upside down, you needed to be able to get to that world and to communicate with that world and to plant churches in places that could reach to the entire civilized world. And that happened during the Roman Empire. There's never been a time before or since when a similar set of events has happened. So when Paul says that Jesus arrived at just the right time, this is exactly what he's talking about. Paul seemed to understand that he was a man who was raised up for such a time as this. It was exactly right. So we're going to share the screen. We're going to go on with this lecture. I'm going to start at Acts chapter 16. Let me see if I can make this happen. Okay, and here it comes. There it goes. Okay, the extension of the church out into the Aegean Sea. This is really the next logical step. When we get to chapter 16, we're going to see that on Paul's second trip, Paul goes out into Asia Minor again, and then finally out to the western end of Asia Minor, where he faces essentially the Aegean Sea. And there's the sun setting farther in the west. Out beyond that disk of the sun is Greece itself. And the thing that makes it challenging to move from Asia Minor into Greece is that there are going to be far fewer Jewish congregations. He's going to have more trouble finding synagogues, and thus more trouble planting the church. It's just not going to happen quite as easily. But he's going to give it a try. And this is where's my Bible? There's my Bible. I don't like walking in and finding my Bible in the wrong spot. I shouldn't let that happen. Okay, so we're told that they went through the region of Phrygia. Let me show the map, because that's going to be helpful. So they left from Antioch, and you see that on the very right in the middle, and headed up through Asia Minor, through Tarsus, then through the churches of Galatia, from Lystra and Derbe and Iconium. They made a straight route all the way up to the upper left-hand corner of Turkey, a place called Troas. And when they had come there, they attempted to go into Bithynia. And you can see on this map, Bithynia is the north coast of Turkey, verges on the Black Sea there. But for some reason, when they were arriving there, the Spirit forbade them to go. Well, we don't know what kind of communication this was, but they understood this is not the way we're supposed to go. And it was at Troas that a vision appeared to Paul in the night. A man of Macedonia was standing there, urging him and saying, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." And when Paul had seen the vision, immediately we sought to go on into Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. Now, there are two things that I want you to notice here. First, I want you to notice the pronouns. The paragraph starts, and they went, and they had come to Mysia, and they went down to Troas, and a vision came to Paul, urging him. And when Paul had seen the vision, we sought to go into Macedonia. Okay, it turns from the third person singular and plural, they, he, him, them, to the first person plural, we. This is the beginning of the first of the famous we passages in Acts. That makes an awful lot of us think that the man from Macedonia may not have been so visionary as is sometimes implied. He might have appeared suddenly in a vision, but he was very real and was actually Dr. Luke himself. I can't prove that, but from this point on, the we passages are very common, and it appears that Luke is a part of the team from this time on. The other thing I want you to see is this, the message, come over to Macedonia and help us. I'm not going to try to quote that in Latin, but in the Latin Vulgate, it comes out the same, come over to Macedonia and help us. The motto of English Anglican missionaries back in the 17th and 18th centuries, when they were trying to get out into the world, comes from this passage. Let's see if I can pronounce it. Trenchans adiovendas. Having crossed over, help us. Come over and help us. Is switched into we we cross over or we travel abroad in order to be of assistance. So I've taken that as kind of a motto for my own ministry. People ask, why do you travel? And I say, well, I travel so that I can be of assistance. I go over there, wherever it is I'm going, so that I can help. Well, what do you do when you help? Well, whatever is necessary. I preach, I teach, I encourage, I raise money, I help with medicine, I make suggestions. I eat a lot. Sometimes I go to hospitals. you all know what it's like, but that's why I travel. I travel to be of assistance. And what the man from Macedonia was asking was, travel over here so that you can help us. And what Paul understood that to mean was, come over here and plant the church in Greece. Now, along the way, I'm going to back up one because there's I want to show you some pictures from the Aegean, just so you know. The Aegean Sea is really truly a very pretty place. The sunsets are amazing, partially from the mist over the Mediterranean, but also because a certain amount of dust blows up from Africa, and you get great sunsets. This is this typical Greek island architecture. It wouldn't surprise me if they had white domed buildings in Paul's day, but today they're often churches that have been turned into museums. Sometimes they're still churches. Greek islands. This one is Santorini. Here's a view from a place on Crete. This is a hillside village on an Aegean island. And don't say that pottery makers don't have a sense of humor. I've always liked this guy. This is the helmet for a Mycenaean warrior. Here's a Greek lion. I don't know what he was doing there, but this one I wanted to stop with. This is the winged victory of Samothrace. Samothrace is an island that is on the way to Greece from Troas. If you follow Paul's line, it goes right past Samothrace, and we're told that Paul and his team stopped at Samothrace. We know that there was a major cult, major religious pilgrimage center on Samothrace, and this statue, the winged victory of Samothrace, which is on display in the Louvre in Paris, was one of the chief idols of that temple. And I don't know very much about it, but there was a major mystery religion surrounding the winged victory of Samothrace. We also know there was no synagogue on Samothrace. So we're told that off they went, and they set out from Troas, made a direct voyage to Samothrace, and the following day to Neapolis. Okay, I'm going to make this go away, see if that can happen, and then go on to the map again. You can see Samothrace is this tiny little island there in the northern Aegean, and the next stop is going to be Neapolis, and then on to Philippi. Now, Neapolis is the port city for Philippi. It's still there today. If you travel in the northern Aegean, particularly by sailboat, Neapolis is not a bad place to stop. We ended up not taking the sailboat to Neapolis. It stopped elsewhere, and we took a bus. But the city is still there. It still has its castle, and it's the port for Philippi. Philippi, on the other hand, has not fared so well. This is a broad shot of the modern ruins at Philippi. Philippi was sacked by the Arabs in about 808 AD, something like that. The northern Aegean was, for the most part, ransacked by the Muslims when they took over this part of the world. The control of the cities of the Aegean went back and forth between the Muslims and others for quite a while. Okay, so they went through, let's see, 6040, forbidden by the Spirit, Troas, yada, da, 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 da. Yeah, okay, from Troas to Samothrace. My notes are in all the wrong places. You know how you can tell that I'm teaching any particular course for the first time? You can tell because my notes are all messed up. It takes me a while to get everything sorted out. Philippi ends up being one of the most important churches that Paul would ever plant. And the story here begins at verse 12 with no synagogue. And so Paul looked for any Jewish population at all and was introduced to a woman named Lydia. Let me show you some photographs from Philippi. Let's see if this works out. This is the traditional spot outside of the city where the river comes through. This is the river that will end up a few miles away in the Mediterranean. And it was said to be very close to this spot and right next to the Egnatian Way that Paul found a place of prayer outside the city and found a woman named Lydia, who was a seller of purple, working there. So he introduced himself, they developed a relationship, and that turned into a series of meetings that resulted in the planting of the church in Philippi. You literally never know what to expect. And we're pretty sure this is actually the right place. There are only so many places where the Egnatian Way is close to the river. And this is the one that's outside the city proper. So this is probably the right place. The Greek Orthodox Church has built a chapel commemorating it. I didn't bother with that one. And there's also a baptismal site here, and the Greek Orthodox Church uses that as well. So let's look a little more. This lady is not Greek. This is my wife. And we were at Philippi several years ago with those college kids who were mightily bored by this time. They'd seen way too many old stones. Donna and I were fascinated, though. Here's another version of that picture. This one I took, or maybe Donna took this one. This is one of three cathedrals in the book of Philippi. This one was built in the 4th or 5th century. It obviously very large and quite elaborate. Great big stones, beautiful arches, colonnades. It's a very, very big ruin. And there were three great big churches right here in Philippi at the time that the city was finally destroyed. This particular church building, I know it doesn't look like much, but this particular church building is octagonal. You can see the flagstones of floor in the foreground. That goes all the way around the octagonal section. You can see pillars, the bases of pillars. Those pillars supported a very large dome. Now, domes were normally built over the tombs of martyrs. Tradition in Philippi is that Paul was buried here. Now, we have tradition elsewhere that says Paul was killed in Rome and buried there. So what we have is a set of competing traditions. There are also churches in Rome that claim to be the burial place of Paul. So that may be what we're looking at here. Nevertheless, whatever else we're saying, Philippi became a very powerful, very important, very influential center for the church. There were large numbers of Christians here. There's no question that this was a large, prosperous Christian center from which, if you look back at the map, and we're not going to right now, at the north end of the Aegean Sea, you've got direct access to Eastern Europe. A walk uphill from Philippi will take you into all kinds of places that are farther north. You can get to Bulgaria and Romania, Czechoslovakia. Eastern Europe opens up from Philippi. The Egnatian Way goes right through Philippi. Egnatian Way connected Constantinople with Rome, with a sea segment along the way, and this is all fairly important stuff for the infrastructure of ancient Rome, but it served to provide the framework for the spreading of the church into all the world. Philippi became the center for the sending of missionaries all over northern and central Europe. And that was true until very late, until roughly the time of the Crusades. Off and on, the Muslims sacked this place. Philippi became a less important city because the trade on the Mediterranean died out. But it still continued to be important up until the time of the Crusades in the thousands and 1200s AD. Okay, so this is yet another one. This is the Egnatian Way. I've got several shots of the Egnatian Way. You can see the big stone pavers. Some of them are covered up by the hillside that has moved over. There's a modern road at the top of the rise on the left, and the fill for that, he said angrily, covers up about half of the Egnatian Way in this section. But that's a very important old Roman road. And notice that thing is very well built. That's been there. It's been lying there like that for 2,500 years. Like I say, you and I should be so well preserved after 2,500 years. I mean, the road is in very good condition. This is a place that is often identified, is traditionally identified as St. Paul's prison. Everyone will tell you that it certainly isn't. It's actually a medieval storage room. It's almost certainly not Paul's prison, but it gives you an idea of what a pile of rocks would look like if it was Paul's prison. These are some more of the ruins in the area. That's a bread maker's oven on the right, and the countertop where he would sell his bread. This is a Greek theater, and Philippi has 2 or 3 of these. The Greek theaters are one of the ways that you can tell that you're looking at a Greco-Roman town. Here's an intersection in the Forum. The Forum was the central public space in any Greco-Roman town. There would be temples and shops and public buildings like a county courthouse and a coliseum for having meetings. All of that would happen in a place like this. Okay, that's Philippi. Not too far away. I'm going to introduce a little bit more of Greek culture, and really Greco-Roman, but this one is really, really Greek. This is a place called Delphi on the Greek mainland. And it gives you an idea of the kind of religion that the apostles, particularly Paul and Luke now, are facing. When they went to Greece to try to establish the church, the Greek people already had a very old, very well respected, and really very impressive religious system. This is the temple of Apollo at Delphi. Delphi is just up the Gulf of Corinth, actually, from the city of Corinth itself. Corinth and Delphi shared the same infrastructure religiously, and the cult of Apollo was a very big deal. Let me show you some slides here. That's another close-up Temple of Apollo. You could tell it's really old because of the columns, and I'm not going to try to teach you the difference between the various kinds of columns, but these are really old. Columns are relatively close together. There's another view of the same thing. They're very heavy, and they're designed to be impressive. You'll probably notice that the columns are slightly narrower at the top than at the bottom, and that the top of the column is this fairly simple capital. Later on, I'm going to show you some other columns, and we'll make some comments, but none of it is very important. What is important is that these things are old and traditional, and they're an important part of the beloved culture of everybody who is Greek. Today, people in Greece still find these things magnificent and wonderful, and they love them. Okay, at Delphi, there was, among other things, in the process of worshiping Apollo, there was what's called an oracle. The oracle was a mechanism for speaking with the gods, particularly to Apollo, but also Zeus and the others. If you wanted to talk to the gods and get answers to your questions, you would come to a place like Delphi, which was one of the most famous. And at Delphi, there was this temple, and there were priestesses, female priests, who worked in the temple, and they had assistants, interpreters, or what they were called, prophets, who would carry questions to the priestess. Whichever priestess was on duty that day, would go into the temple, and some would say that she sniffed at the fumes from a volcano, but that's not true. If you look carefully at Greece, you'll discover there aren't any volcanoes. She wasn't sniffing fumes, but she may have been smoking something. We don't know. The priestess would go into a hallucinogenic trance, during which she would speak in tongues, ecstatic utterance, and communicate with the gods. The message would come back inaudibly, and the priestess would then come to her prophets and speak in a tongue to the prophets. The prophets would interpret that tongue as a message from the gods for whoever was asking the question. Modern scholars have pretty much come to the conclusion that the popularity of the gift of tongues in the Greek churches was closely related to the practice of tongues at the oracles.
We know that that Delphi and Corinth in particular had these. Let's look around a little more. That's the view from this place. It's way up in the mountains, quite pretty. The water channel. This is the treasury. We don't know what kind of treasure was in there. Those stones are deliberately cut that way. I don't have any idea why you would cut your stones in that kind of a pattern, unless you wanted to impress people with your ability to cut stones. They've got a flat edge here, and all of the rest of it is just a big boulder. Quite amazing. This is a small theater at Delphi. You'll notice it's right on the side of the hill. That thing is a great big inscription. You can see a small modern inscription. Tourists are not allowed to walk on this, but the bigger one is more important. This is that theater again, and that's Delphi. Philippi and Delphi are a couple of places that are very significant. Paul has a ministry in Philippi. He led Lydia to the Lord. She is a Gentile who is a worshiper of God. She probably had been a polytheist, like other Greeks at this time, but she began to attend the synagogue. She didn't undergo conversion to Judaism, but we're told in verse 14 that she is one who heard us, a woman named Lydia from the city of Thyatira, a seller of purple. The Lord opened her heart to pay attention to what was said by Paul. And again, notice who is doing the primary work. Paul is there and is presenting the gospel, but it's the Lord who opened her heart. Luke is very careful about these things. He obviously has been influenced by Paul's teaching and wants to make sure to always keep the definitions of terms clear. The Lord opened her heart, and so the group stayed there. She was baptized with her household, and she prevailed upon us to stay. Shortly after that, Paul was thrown in prison. He was going to the place of prayer, met by a slave girl, this is verse 16, with a spirit of divination. And she brought her owners a lot of money by fortune telling, as she followed Paul, crying out, "These men are servants of the Most High God," which is an interesting line. The term "the Most High God" is a name for God that usually occurs in the Bible on the lips of Gentiles, people who are outside of Judaism and don't know the correct name for God. This girl was calling out, "These are the servants of the Most High God." It was probably a little obnoxious, most likely loud, grating, but accurate enough. Paul finally tired of it and commanded the demon who inhabited this girl to leave her, which it did. And the owners of this particular girl, she's a slave, of course, saw that their profit was gone. They didn't care about this poor girl. They were upset that she'd been freed from a demon. This tells you a little bit about what kind of people these were. The reaction has to do with the elimination of their livelihood, and so the owners
seized Paul and Silas, dragged them into the marketplace before the rulers. They brought them to the magistrates. It said, "These are Jews disturbing our city. They advocate customs not lawful for us." And the crowd joined in attacking them, and the magistrates tore the garments off them and gave orders to beat them with rods. And when they had inflicted many blows, they threw them in prison, ordering the jailer to keep them safely. Well, that night, of course, the Philippian jailer is going to be converted. About midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns. The prisoners were listening. You know, Paul says, I've learned to be content with what I have. And what he had was accommodation in a little stone prison. And the other inmates were listening as Paul was singing and praying and preaching. And apparently he had their attention. And suddenly there was a great earthquake, and the foundations of the prison were shaken, and all the doors were opened, and everyone's bonds were unfastened, which would take quite the miraculous earthquake to do that without killing everybody. But anyway, everybody's chains were unfastened, and the jailer, supposing that all the prisoners had escaped, drew his sword to kill himself. But Paul cried out, "Don't harm yourself, here we are." And the jailer called for lights, rushed in, fell down before Paul and Silas and said, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" Now, we often take it for granted that what the jailer is asking here is, what can I do for salvation in the spiritual sense? And of course, that's not what the jailer was asking for at all. He said, the jail is destroyed and you're all loose. I'm in bad trouble. Do you have any suggestions on how I can get myself out of this? That's what he was asking. But Paul's answer is simply believe in the Lord Jesus and you will be saved, you and your household. The Philippian jailer, who probably had heard some of Paul's preaching by this time, decided that anybody who could do a thing like this deserved to be listened to. And he took them that same hour, washed their wounds. He was baptized at once, he and all his family. And then he brought them up into his house, set food before them, and they rejoiced. But when it was day, the magistrates sent the police, saying, "Let them loose." And the jailer reported these words to Paul, saying, "The magistrates have sent to let you go." And then Paul, I love it, having released him, the jailer lets them out. He was the magistrates of the city were hoping to get Paul out quietly, but Paul would have none of that. He said, "They have beaten us publicly, uncondemned, men who are Roman citizens, and they've thrown us into prison, and now they expect to throw us out secretly. Sorry, we're not having that. Let them come themselves and take us out." And the police reported these words to the magistrates, and they were afraid when they had heard that they were Roman citizens. So Roman citizenship has its privileges. If you were not a Roman citizen, you could be beaten by the magistrates without a problem. But a Roman citizen couldn't be beaten without a trial. He had to be heard before the magistrates. The evidence had to be presented, and he had to have opportunity to explain, to answer the accusations. So Paul was simply standing up for his rights. Afterwards, he decides to go, not the least bit quietly, and he met again with Lydia, and these three characters, Lydia, the demoniac girl, and the jailer, couldn't be more different. They come from completely different places in life. Lydia would have been quite a wealthy woman. The jailer would have been a middle-class person. The girl was a slave. And yet Paul interacts with each of them
in exactly the right way. It finds a way to reach them. All of this was prepared by the Spirit of God himself. And yet Paul walked in and creatively found ways to engage them with the gospel. The gospel is very good news. Sharing it with people is such a good thing to do for them. Okay, from there, Paul and Silas head off to Thessalonica. And I've never been in Thessalonica, except I think we were in Thessalonica once on an airplane. And we stopped there on our way to somewhere else. At any rate, this is a modern freeway through the modern city of Thessalonica. Thessalonica is just up the Aegean way from Philippi. It would be about a 2-day journey from Philippi, and it's also an important entryway into Macedonia and into Eastern Europe. And we see the proclamation in the synagogue in the first parts of chapter 17. The sermon of Paul here is very briefly mentioned. He says that the scriptures predict that Messiah would suffer and be raised. Jesus suffered for our sins and was raised. Therefore, Jesus is the Messiah. That's a very simple summary of what Paul would likely have said. He most likely spoke for an hour or more, but we have just this brief introduction. In verse 4, we're told that some of the Jews and some of the Greeks believed. The Greeks probably didn't know quite what was going on with all this messianic talk. They would have had more of a political conception. Nevertheless, there were some Greeks and some Jews, this mixed reaction. This is fairly common. Beginning at verse 5, the Jews who did not believe were jealous. And the target of their anger was a character named Jason, who would have been probably one of the elders at the synagogue there in Thessalonica. He's not otherwise identified. We don't see him. And this is the spot in verse. Let me find it. They couldn't find them. They dragged them, and in verse 6, the end of verse 6, the Jews say, "These men who have turned the world upside down have come here also." Jason received them. They're acting against the decrees of Caesar, saying there's another king, one Jesus. Okay, that's the basic message. They misunderstand the gospel message. And the most important part of it is that here the date probably has to be about 51 AD. We're told here are those men that we've heard of before who are turning the world upside down. And so they were. The church has at its disposal the power to turn the world upside down. And we're not expected to turn the whole planet upside down all at one time. But we're expected to make an impact on the community that we're a part of. So I was listening to our pastor preach last Sunday at a little church of Bayview here in Greater Idaho. And he talked about having an impact on the Bayview, Athol, and whatever Kerrywood community. Tiny little logging agriculture resort area here in North Idaho, out in the woods. And that's the world that we want to turn upside down here. Wherever you are right now, whether in Como or Rimini or Reggio or Pampanga, God intends that the church there turn its world upside down. We need to make an impact, whether it's whether it's entirely positive or not. Sometimes people are going to be angry with us, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Okay, so that's that. From Thessalonica, they're going to go on to Berea. I've never been in Berea, but these are stones on the Egnatian Way that will eventually take Paul to Berea. It's an interesting little story. Berea is not mentioned very much. They sent Paul and Silas away by night. They arrived, went to the synagogue there. The Jews were more noble than those at Thessalonica. They received the word with all eagerness, examining the scriptures daily to see if these things were so. Now, frankly, that's a good reaction. Rather than simply responding emotionally, the Jews in Berea said, "Well, that's an interesting claim you make. Let's go to the scriptures. Let's look at Deuteronomy and the Psalms and Isaiah and see what the scriptures actually say, because that's really what's important. What's important is not what I say the scripture says, is what the scriptures actually say." And some of them believed. They received the word with eagerness and examining the scriptures, and many of them, therefore, believed, with not a few Greek women of high standing, as well as men. Why the women are mentioned, I don't know, but they are. But when the Jews from Thessalonica heard that the word of God was proclaimed in Berea, they came agitating, stirring things up, and the brothers sent Paul off on his way to the sea. But Silas and Timothy remained there. Those who conducted Paul brought him as far as Athens. Welcome to Athens. Athens is down near the Wasp Waste of southern Greece. And is the capital of Greece, the most important city that is there. This photograph that you see is one that I took about 30 years ago. I took a group of college seniors and their hosts actually to Israel, but we started off in Athens. And it was the middle of the night. We flew into Athens. We'd missed a flight earlier in the day. So the middle of the night, we took taxis into downtown Athens and had no place to sleep. And so I walked them to the top of a hill in the middle of Athens called the Lycabettus, where I knew there was a monastery, an old monastery. And we unrolled our sleeping bags and caught a few hours of sleep on the top of the Lycabettus until the sun began to come up. That was probably about 5 a.m. And I woke up and got my camera out and took this picture of the Acropolis. That's the Parthenon on the left and one of the other temples on the right of the Acropolis of Athens, one of the more famous structures in the world. Athens is quite the place. Let's see if I can show you just a few. This is the Acropolis from below. The Greek columns are like we've seen before, great, big, magnificent things. More Greek columns, Greek statues. This is Mars Hill. It doesn't look like much of a mountain, and it's not. It's a raised, flat rock area that in biblical times probably had a few monuments on top, but all of those are gone now. This is the place that Paul is going to interact with the Greek philosophers. This is a temple of Zeus. And there's Zeus himself getting ready to hurl thunderbolts. Here's a temple with nymphs or naiads. Here's some, this is a Greek philosopher on the left, speaking with a Greek politician on the right, being guided by the Greek goddess of wisdom, Sophia, in the back. So anyway, the Greeks had it all. Athens was an ancient city by the time Paul got there. And his interaction with the Athenians is fascinating. He arrives alone. The Sermon on Mars Hill is probably the most complex sermon in the book of Acts. It's the most complete approach that we see to Paul speaking to a Gentile audience. One of the things that Paul doesn't do in the Acts 17 sermon is make a big deal about the Old Testament. He doesn't make the argument from biblical prophecy. Instead, he begins with the idea of the unknown God. Paul was moved to anger by the idols in the city. There were temples all over the place. The Acropolis in the time of Paul was covered over with temples. There would have been thousands of idols on top of the Acropolis. And Paul would have been moved to anger by all of this. And he argued that you are in all ways very religious, but I see that you have among you an unknown God. You have an altar here to an unknown God. And there's a story that goes with that. Sometime in Athens past, they were being attacked by some enemy, and one of the philosophers said, perhaps we're not praying to the right God. We need to make a sacrifice to yet another God. So they built an altar to an unknown God and made a sacrifice to that one. Paul says, I see you even have an altar to an unknown God. Well, this God whom you worship in ignorance, I now proclaim to you. He began to give a name to the unknown God who had delivered Athens from its trouble. It's an interesting approach. What it tells us is that Paul was willing to be creative. He was willing to go whichever way he needed to go in order to get through to people. And the fact was, this didn't work so well. We have a couple of different groups. The Epicureans are mentioned. These would have been the equivalent of modern agnostics or secularists. They didn't believe in much of anything. They certainly believed nothing about the gods. They said there's nothing to fear in the gods. There's nothing to feel in death. Pleasure can be attained. Pain can be endured. They preferred pleasure over pain, but recognized that there's not much you can do about any of it. The Epicureans are an interesting group, and their philosophy continues to be a modern liberal philosophy. The Stoics were important in Athens at this time. They tended to be pantheistic. They believed that God is everything. The entire created universe is, in fact, God. They didn't believe in a bunch of individual gods, but rather that the universe is God. They taught the unity of man with the divine. If man is a part of the universe, then man is a part of God. They put an emphasis on human reason. The whole world is one state. The idea of a global government would have worked very well for the Stoics. They liked that. Stoics are interesting on a lot of levels. They continue to have
an impact today. These very, very smart people listened to Paul and reacted. Some saw Paul as a babbler. The Greek word means a seed picker, a scavenger, like a bird. Some saw him as a teacher about foreign deities. And what we don't see is much of a note about believers. The dispute on the Areopagus in chapter 17 was in response to an invitation to provide an explanation for his new teaching, because the city council wanted in on this. So Paul's message in chapter 17 begins with this. He uses the unknown God and proclaims to them the true God. In verses 32 through 34, Paul receives a mixed reaction. Greek philosophy in general rejected the notion of a resurrection. So when Paul came to that point in his message, he lost the Greek philosopher types. Others were willing to keep an open mind and maybe hear Paul again sometime. And a third, likely very much smaller group, were believers. And that becomes the core of the Athenian church. But very significantly, Paul never comes back to Athens, and he doesn't write a letter to Athens. Nothing more is mentioned about the church in Athens. And in church history, we find the church in Athens was not a major missionary sending church. It existed because culturally the Greek people went over to Christianity, but it was never a major church, and that is probably largely because of the philosophical base. Okay, Athens. Let's go on to Corinth. Chapter 18 is all about Paul in Corinth. He left Athens, went to Corinth, found a Jew named Aquila. This is the introduction to Aquila and Priscilla, who are merchants. They are merchants who we're also going to run into in Rome. These two get around. Found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had demanded all the Jews to leave Rome, which would have happened in 48 AD. Because he was of the same trade as they were, they must have been tent makers. He reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath, tried to persuade Jews and Greeks. Silas and Timothy finally arrived from Macedonia. Paul was occupied with the word, testifying to the Jews that Christ was Jesus. And when they opposed and reviled him, he shook out his garments and said, "Your blood be on your own heads. I'm innocent. From now on, I'll go to the Gentiles." And off he went. He went to the house of a man named Titus Justus, a worshiper of God, whose house was next door to the synagogue. Crispus, together, the ruler of the synagogue, together with his entire household, many of the Corinthians, hearing Paul, believed and were baptized. And the Lord said to Paul one night in a vision, "Don't be afraid, but go on speaking. Don't be silent. I'm with you. No one will attack you to harm you, for I have many in this city who are my people." So there's God telling Paul, in the midst of this pagan city, there's going to be a church. Now, Corinth is a fascinating place. I'm going to show you some shots from Corinth. This is a view of the main street of Corinth, the Cardo. The Synagogue of Corinth is on the right side of this street. We've actually found the Greek sign saying this is the house of the Jews. It's on the right side of the street. I can't show you the exact building, but it's there. The thing in the background with a little bit of a building on top is called the Areopagus, or the Oh my God, the Corinth, the high place of Corinth. There was a fortress up there and also temples. On the hillside were thousands of small altars and temples and um, meeting places where food would be served and where parties of people could meet with prostitutes. Corinth was a very wicked city. It makes Sodom and Gomorrah sound like a Sunday school picnic. The seamen would come into Corinth in their ships, coming up one gulf and going out the other way. And there were lots and lots of foreigners, travelers, and itinerants coming through Corinth. And it was a very wicked place. And that shows up in Paul's letters to Corinth later. Now, a few pictures. You'll recognize the structure of this temple. Looks just like Delphi. The same kind of pillars. And again, this is a temple of Apollo. This is a part of the business district. This is the Bema, the city hall of Corinth, with the Acrocorinth in the background, and a Corinthian lion, in case you ever wondered what he looked like. Here's part of a temple, some ruins of a temple, and then something fascinating. This is the Corinth Canal. This actually dug by the French. The Romans wanted to dig a canal, but they didn't have the equipment. The French, under Napoleon, finally did this. It's one of the most famous canal projects in the world. It's about 2 miles long, and is a wonder of the pre-modern world. I don't know, 18th century with Napoleon. But at any rate, when I took our sailboat kids to Corinth, they couldn't be bothered to look at the Corinth Canal. So Donna and I walked over here and took this picture. And I think it's a pretty nice picture. This is a view from the top. You can see the Gulf of Corinth there. The canal is right down in the lowest spot. The city of Corinth is in the flat land between where I'm standing on the Acrocorinth and down below. Here is an Apollo statue. Lots and lots of idols. Here's Apollo as the sun god. And this is one of the more famous things. I may have shown you this in the Romans lecture. This is the Erastus inscription found in the theater of Corinth. Erastus was one of the city fathers and had invested in the construction of the theater. Okay, so from Corinth, Paul is going to go on back to Antioch. And this is in 18 through 22. And they came to Ephesus and then on to Caesarea. And immediately they're going to depart. We're told in verse 23, back through Galatia and on into the third missionary journey. So we'll come back on, what is today? Wednesday. We'll be back on Monday, and we'll start with Paul's third missionary journey, which will take him back through Galatia and visit all of these churches. And there's a couple of very important spots that Paul is going to stop on his third journey. We'll see how that works out. Anyway, I'm going to make this stop, and then I'm going to turn the sound on so that Donna can hear. And I'm going to unmute everybody. All right, there we go. Okay, so here we are in our comfortable spot on the deck of a 90-foot schooner in the Aegean Sea, sort of, and wishing we were with you all. Yeah.
Beautiful background.
Okay. Bye-bye, everybody. We'll see you on Monday.
Thank you very
Bye-bye.
much. Ciao, Donna.
Jan.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr.
Bye-bye,
Jan.
Oscar.
Ciao tutti.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Hey,
Thank you.
Dolly, I see you there.
Hello.
Okay. Oscar, let me know if there's anything I can do to help with buildings in Pangasinan.
Okay.
Just keep me informed. God bless everybody. We'll see you Monday. Bye-bye.